Welcome to the dark world of scary stories, a place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Roots of Darkness. The curse of the new earth. On one of those dark and gloomy evenings, when there was nothing around but deep forests and endless fields, the town of Randallsville had no idea that a dreadful end awaited it. It all began with unusual news. Rumors of a strange anomaly spread across the country. Scientists spoke of a new type of plant that had started appearing in the forests and fields, where just yesterday there had been nothing like it. These plants grew incredibly fast and were distinguished by their enormous size. Quietly and unnoticed, they covered the land around the town at night. Giant stems rose into the sky, where flowers of unusual shapes bloomed. People who saw them began to say that these flowers only bloomed at night, and their scent was intoxicatingly strong. At first, the locals found it just an interesting event. People gathered at night to watch these amazing flowers, captivated by their beauty, unaware that they were becoming a direct threat. The scent of the flowers was so powerful that some began to feel strange. At first, it was mild nausea, then a headache. People started coughing, and soon they were overwhelmed by deep fear. But no one understood that this was just the beginning of a horrific transformation. By morning, when the sun rose, the plants had already grown massive. They became so large that they began to overshadow the entire town, casting darkness even in the daylight hours. And the air was filled with an increasingly stronger toxic scent. People began to fall ill. Before their eyes, a terrible reaction developed. Their skin turned pale gray, their hair fell out, and their eyes turned red and watered uncontrollably. But the most terrifying thing was that with each passing day, the infected people grew wilder, as though losing their sanity. Randallsville quickly began to turn into a ghost town. Those who survived tried to escape, but the plants had already completely surrounded the town. They stretched their roots, flooding every corner with toxic dust. Those who tried to flee became victims of an even worse illness. They couldn't run far, as each breath grew heavier, and blisters began to appear on their skin. One day, when night fell again over the town, one of the last survivors, a man named Thomas, decided to leave his shelter. He was shocked by how quickly the plants were growing. He saw them covering every house, like enormous hands that were swallowing everything in their path. All this time, strange sounds could be heard in the dark corners of the town. It was like a quiet whisper, similar to muffled breathing. Hiding from the infected, Thomas found a note left by one of the local scientists. It described how the plants had started spreading across the corners of the earth. This was part of an experiment that had spiraled out of control. The plants had been modified to quickly absorb harmful elements from the atmosphere. But instead of cleaning the air, they had turned it into a poisonous fog. Thomas tried to understand how to stop these plants, but every step he took only brought him closer to another wave of horror. His heart raced when he heard footsteps behind him. Long before he could turn around, one of the infected women appeared in front of him. Her eyes glowed red, and her skin was covered in dark spots. She reached out a hand, which seemed to be covered in a layer of decaying plant matter. Feeling that he had only a few minutes left, Thomas ran to the nearest station, hoping to find help. But the horror he encountered was not just in the plants, but also in the people who had become part of them. They were no longer humans. They were creatures infected by the poison of the flowers, and their goal was to turn everything into this horrifying new world. Thomas witnessed how several of them, teaming up, began attacking others who were still alive. Each one became more and more like a plant. Their eyes brightened, their hands turned into roots, and their breathing grew deeper and heavier. Thomas realized that there was probably only one way to rid the world of this plague: destroy the plants. He found an old tractor and headed for the fields, knowing that only fire could stop this dreadful phenomenon. But by the time he reached the field, his strength was fading. He saw the plants starting to rise, filling every horizon. This was the beginning of the end for Randallsville. No one knows if Thomas managed to execute his plan. The remainder of his story is shrouded in mystery. The town was flooded with toxic flowers, and the plants continued to spread, leaving no chance for salvation. Even today, when you approach these lands, you can still feel that same scent in the air, the smell of flowers that still draws you in, even though you know it's no longer what you want to find. Thomas sat in his predicament, overwhelmed by despair, as real hell unfolded around him. The plants seemed to never cease their relentless movement. With every step, he noticed how the earth was being consumed by new green monsters. They grew so fast that it seemed their roots were expanding in real time, devouring everything alive around them. His heart raced as he realized he wasn't just trying to survive. With every passing minute, he was getting closer to the terrifying truth he had feared. The plants weren't just polluting the land. They were turning living organisms into part of themselves. Scientists had spoken of this, but Thomas couldn't believe it until he saw how people were slowly transforming into horrific hybrids, resembling the plants that were starting to grow directly from their bodies. Men and women who had walked the streets just the day before had now become soulless creatures, moving only on instinct. Their bodies were filled with decaying plant life, their faces hidden behind thick layers of green crust. Their eyes glowed red, like wild animals endlessly searching for prey. Thomas couldn't stop his heart from pounding in his chest. Each breath was filled with toxic air that seemed to choke him with every step. He kept moving, not knowing where to find salvation. His soul was gripped by increasing fear. He knew that even if he found a way to destroy these plants, even if he could uproot them, it wouldn't change what had already happened. Thomas reached an old shop, hiding from another group of infected. There, he found several books and notes left by those who, in their final hours, had tried to find a solution. In one of the books, he stumbled upon an ancient manuscript that told a sinister tale about a tribe that once worshipped ancient plants, which would extend their toxic petals to consume everything around them. These plants were sacred beings, but they had one dreadful secret. Their bloom didn't just kill people. It turned them into part of themselves, filling their bodies with painful plant life. The manuscript also mentioned a way to stop them. Only fire could destroy these plants, burning them to the roots, stripping them of their power. But there was one catch. If the plant left part of itself on the ground, it could regenerate. So even after burning it, one couldn't be sure it was the end. The fire had to destroy everything, roots, petals, and even the dust settling in the air. Thomas knew he had to act quickly, or everything would be in vain. He set off toward the largest plant, growing on the outskirts of the town, hoping it might be the only chance for salvation. However, as he approached the enormous flower, an overwhelming sense of dread gripped his heart. The massive stems of the plant, reaching for the sky like demonic hands, had already begun to move, searching for new objects to infect. Thomas felt a gaze coming from the darkness. He turned around and saw a woman, one of those who had become part of the plant monster. Her body was covered in horrific plant life, and her eyes glowed red. She was no longer human. She was a dreadful creature, moving slowly, looking for her next victim to consume. The infected woman took a step forward, and Thomas felt his breath grow heavy. He knew turning back meant certain death, so he decided not to let this creature take him. Remembering fire as his last hope, he grabbed a bottle of gasoline he had found in the basement of a house. Quickly, Thomas sprayed it around him on the ground and set it alight. The fire ignited quickly, and suddenly another creature emerged from the darkness. And although a part of his consciousness still reminded him of his human existence, that part was gradually fading, consumed by the new, incomprehensible world. And so, when the last sounds of civilization were silenced in the dark, when every trace of human life had disappeared, the earth was already different. The plants that had once sought to consume everything around them had now become the new rulers of the world, reshaping it to their will. The toxic flowers that once poisoned the air now bloomed in beautiful, though ominous, forms that could spread in every corner of the earth. And so, after the last hope of humanity gasped its final breath, those who had become part of this new reality remained in the darkness. They were no longer humans, nor plants. They were something greater. He couldn't see what happened after, as everything was engulfed in thick smoke and ash. When he finally opened his eyes, the town was eerily silent. The plants had begun to die, their stems withered, and the toxic scent was gone. But Thomas realized this was not the end. Through the smoke, he saw new dark clouds forming in the sky. The plants might have perished, but something else was starting to sprout from the depths of the earth. What had truly happened with these plants? What else was hidden beneath the ground of Randallsville? And did the destruction of one generation mean the end for all? The horror was only beginning. Because in the darkness, where there was no hope, where no light remained, new monsters were waiting for their time. Thomas stood amidst the silence that had engulfed the city, his breathing heavy, his hands covered in ash. He felt utterly exhausted, like a person who had survived a war. The fire he had set had finally consumed the remnants of the plants, their thick roots, from which no new stems would sprout. But something was wrong. His instincts told him that this wasn't the end. Instead of relief, he felt his heart tightening in his chest. The sky darkened, and the air grew thick and heavy. Thomas turned around and saw the earth begin to crack, like the peeling of old crust. From the depths, a new wave began to rise. Not plants, but something far more terrifying. These were roots, growing not on the surface, but beneath the earth. They were not just plants, they were a civilization. It had existed deep underground, long hidden from human eyes. These beings were neither fully plants nor fully animals. They were something else, enormous organisms combining both essences. And now they were rising from the depths of the earth, carving their way through the ruined streets and scorched fields. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. Before him stood not just a few new plants, but a true monster growing from the earth's depths. Giant roots were tearing through cracks, wrapping around everything in their path. Their enormous stems began to absorb the earth, taking with them everything that remained of civilization. From this dark mass extended arms, resembling green tentacles, that could reach even the most distant places. With every movement they made, more earth was swallowed into the abyss, and Thomas stood among this terrifying sight, feeling his heart pounding wildly once more. He realized this wasn't just a plant disease. This was an entire stage of evolution. Something incredible was awakening, and now no fire could stop this apocalypse. Could this shadow be defeated? Could they truly destroy what had awakened, or were they merely a temporary obstacle to it? It seemed likely that it was already too late. This wasn't just an accident or a mistake of nature. The plants weren't just a disease. They had become an instrument of rebirth, part of a bigger picture that humanity hadn't seen. Thomas moved toward the largest root emerging from the ground and suddenly felt a strong gust of wind. His clothes were blown away, and he saw dark clouds, which had enveloped everything around him, starting to turn back. This wasn't wind. It was a desperate signal that something far worse was coming. There was no time for doubt. If he didn't act now, what was left of Randallsville would become nothing but a legend, eventually to be sacrificed by the earth itself, swallowed by these creatures. He raised his weapon, loading the last rounds in hope of at least delaying the approaching evil. But as he reached toward the sky to try and summon one final desperate explosion, the ground began to tremble beneath his feet. The plants had become the new masters of Earth, and humanity had become mere shadows in their great world. And this world had been reborn into something new, terrifying, and unpredictable. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. It wasn't just a plant. It was a creature. And this creature began to rise and transform into a giant, horrifying mass, resembling a monster that combined all the terrors of human imagination. The sky above Thomas began to change before his eyes. The enormous plants that had filled the land began to release their flowers into the heavens. These flowers bloomed in such a way that they began releasing vast amounts of toxic dust, covering every horizon. It could be seen for miles from Randallsville. But this was just the beginning. The survivors began to notice changes. Their skin became covered in a thick greenish film. They started to exhibit new abilities, strange reflexes, and behavioral changes. Some of those who had survived set off for other cities, hoping to find salvation. But it was clear that it no longer mattered. The plants that had spread were too strong. They could not be stopped. And so, the city, once vibrant and rich, became part of this new, all-consuming reality. The plants were no longer just part of the world. They had become its new masters. And even Thomas, the last witness who had tried to fight, was changing, his body becoming more and more like part of the earth, just like all those who had ended up in this hell. His mind remained, but his body was no longer his. He was dead, consumed by these relentless flowers. Meanwhile, deep in the darkness of the earth, new roots were already beginning to awaken, ready to take the place of their predecessors. This was the end of the world no one had expected. Thomas felt his mind beginning to detach from reality as his body transformed more and more under the influence of a strange force that permeated every cell of him. This wasn't just a change, it was evolution, but not natural. It was terrifying. He couldn't tell if his consciousness was still human or if he had become something else, part of what had emerged from the depths. When he opened his eyes, he saw everything around him transforming. The massive plants seemed to have their own thoughts now. Their flowers no longer simply bloomed. They were living beings, moving, pulling their petals like arms, reaching out to cover the earth again with a new toxic cloud. The people who were still alive began to change. Some even approached the plants, as if submitting to their will, trying to merge with them. Now, when blood and flesh no longer mattered, people became part of a greater organism. This was no longer a battle. It was an irreversible merging of two worlds, where nature had triumphed. As the plants continued to dominate, their roots penetrated the earth so deeply that it seemed they were entwining with all of humanity's memories. The city, once filled with music, where people celebrated, loved, and dreamed, was now consumed by this relentless force. Those who had not changed had become echoes of the past, buried beneath the green mass that moved and bloomed, swallowing everything alive. Thomas felt his breath slow, and his body no longer obeyed him. He was no longer simply a human. He was part of a new civilization rising from the depths of the earth. And although a part of his consciousness still reminded him of his human existence, that part was gradually fading, consumed by the new, incomprehensible world. And so, when the last sounds of civilization were silenced in the dark, when every trace of human life had disappeared, the earth was already different. The plants that had once sought to consume everything around them had now become the new rulers of the world, reshaping it to their will. The toxic flowers that once poisoned the air now bloomed in beautiful, though ominous, forms that could spread in every corner of the earth. And so, after the last hope of humanity gasped its final breath, those who had become part of this new reality remained in the darkness. They were no longer humans, nor plants. They were something greater. Something that had risen from oblivion and created a new reality. All the legends, all the warnings about enormous plants that could conquer the world, had become reality. And this was just the beginning chapter in the history of the new planet. What awaits those who remain in the dark, who may still awaken from this horrific dream? Thomas could not know. Perhaps he had already become part of this new being, this new force that ruled the world. Perhaps the darkness had consumed both his mind and soul. But now, as everything around him was caught in this ominous cycle, he understood this was no longer a question of battle. The plants had become the new masters of Earth, and humanity had become mere shadows in their great world. And this world had been reborn into something new, terrifying, and unpredictable. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.